It was a cold, quiet night. The kind of night that felt as if the world outside had frozen in time. Julia sat alone in the dimly lit living room of her small apartment, staring at the empty space around her. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders. She hadn't been able to sleep for days, the loss still too fresh in her heart. The pain was all-consuming, and she couldn't shake it. Her eyes lingered on the photographs on the wall, old pictures of happier days, smiles frozen in time. But now, there was nothing but a vast emptiness. She wrapped her arms around herself, seeking warmth, but nothing could fill the void inside her. Then she heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable, like a soft scrape at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, unsure if it was just the wind or something else. The sound came again, this time louder. A soft, persistent mew. Julia hesitated. She hadn't been expecting anyone. No one came here anymore. But the sound was real. It wasn't in her head. With a deep breath, she rose from the couch and walked toward the door. As she opened it, she was met with a small, trembling kitten. Its fur was matted, its eyes wide and pleading. A tabby cat with striking green eyes that seemed to see right through her stood there, shaking in the cold night air. The kitten didn't run away. It simply stared at her, as if it had known she needed it, as if it had been waiting for her. The moment felt surreal, almost as if this was the very thing she had been missing. Julia kneeled down, unsure what to do, but instinctively she reached out to the small creature. The kitten hesitated, but then it crawled into her arms, purring softly as she gently held it. Despite its trembling, there was something comforting in its presence. For the first time in days, Julia felt something stir inside her, a sense of warmth, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She whispered softly to the kitten, "I don't know what to do with you, little one, but you can stay if you need to." The kitten responded with a quiet, grateful meow and snuggled into her arms. Julia sat back on the couch, holding the tiny creature against her chest, feeling its tiny heartbeat against hers. It was like the world had stopped, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, everything was okay. But as Julia drifted off to sleep with Milo, the kitten she had named, curled up next to her, she had no idea that this was just the beginning. Something had shifted, but she couldn't yet understand what. Milo had come into her life for a reason, but what was it? Could this tiny kitten truly change everything for her? The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft rays over Julia's small living room. She awoke, startled for a moment, then relaxed when she remembered Milo, the little kitten who had wandered into her life just a few days ago. His warm, soft body was nestled against her side, his small chest rising and falling with every contented purr. Julia smiled, her first genuine smile in what felt like weeks. Milo had become her little companion, her comfort, and in those brief moments, everything felt more bearable. But as the days passed, the unease in her heart grew. Milo, for all his smallness and tenderness, was an enigma. He would dart around the apartment, his tiny paws tapping on the hardwood floors, chasing shadows that only he could see. There were moments when he'd freeze, his ears twitching as if he heard something Julia could not. And then, just as suddenly, he would leap into her lap, his bright green eyes locking with hers as if asking for reassurance. She didn't know what to make of it. As much as he was a comfort, Milo seemed unsettled, restless in a way that unsettled Julia too. She'd catch him staring out the window, watching the world as if he were waiting for something. Or perhaps it was someone. That thought made Julia uneasy. Was it possible that Milo wasn't just a stray kitten, but something else altogether? It wasn't long before she noticed that when the sun set and the night crept in, Milo would grow even more agitated. His ears would flatten, his tail would puff up, and he'd meow urgently at the door. At first, Julia thought it was just his natural kitten curiosity, but after a few nights, the behavior seemed more than just playful. It was as if Milo sensed something she couldn't. One night, as the wind howled outside, Julia sat curled up on the couch, trying to read a book but unable to focus. The apartment was quiet except for Milo, who had stopped playing and was sitting motionless, staring toward the door with an intensity that made Julia's skin prickle. His eyes, wide and unblinking, never left the door. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the other side of the apartment. Startled, Julia dropped her book. Her heart raced as she slowly stood, her breath shallow. She glanced at Milo, who had not flinched, his focus entirely on the door. Slowly, Julia walked toward the hallway, the darkness making the space seem even more ominous than usual. The air was thick with tension, and each step she took echoed in the silence. The thud came again, louder this time. Milo remained still, his gaze locked on the door. Julia reached for the handle, her pulse quickening. She hesitated, her hand just inches away from the knob. What was it? Was she imagining things? The kitten let out a low growl, a sound she had never heard him make before. Julia stepped back, startled. Milo was clearly afraid, and that fear, deep, instinctual fear, seemed to be pulling them both towards something she couldn't see, something lurking just outside their perception. With one last look at Milo, Julia took a breath and opened the door. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but an empty hallway, dark and silent. But as Julia stepped inside, she noticed something strange, a small wet paw print, fresh and glistening in the dim light. But the kitten hadn't moved. The prints led toward the end of the hall, and Julia's heart pounded in her chest. Who or what had left these marks? The morning after the strange paw prints appeared, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hallway, once just a part of her everyday life, now felt like a place she was meant to avoid. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights made her jump, as if the apartment was alive with hidden secrets she couldn't see. Milo, however, seemed unaffected. He returned to his usual self, chasing his toy mouse across the living room, curling up in the sun's warm patches on the floor, and purring when Julia picked him up to cuddle. But every now and then, his ears would twitch, and his gaze would drift toward the hallway as if he was waiting for something, or someone. Julia tried to convince herself it was all just her imagination. After all, Milo was just a kitten. Maybe she had been too tired, too emotionally drained from everything in her life to notice the obvious. But the paw prints, the silence that seemed to stretch for miles, and the way Milo reacted made it impossible to ignore. There was something else at play. Late that afternoon, while cleaning out some old boxes in the closet, Julia found a box that made her heart skip a beat. It was an old, dusty shoebox, the kind you keep hidden in the back of a closet, filled with things you don't want to face. She opened it reluctantly, but her curiosity won over. Inside, she found old photographs, faded letters, and mementos from her childhood, things she hadn't thought about in years. As she rifled through the contents, one letter caught her attention. It was from her mother, written just before her passing. Julia hadn't read it in so long, the words seemed foreign at first, but when she began to read, her eyes blurred with tears. It was a simple letter, filled with love and advice, but the last few lines hit her like a punch to the stomach. Sometimes love comes in unexpected ways, even from those we least expect. Don't be afraid to let it in, even when it seems too late. Julia wiped away a tear as she clutched the letter to her chest. Her mother's words, so simple yet so powerful, brought a sense of peace she hadn't realized she'd been missing. It was as if, in this letter, her mother had given her permission to move forward, to stop clinging to the past. She put the letter down and looked at Milo, who was now sitting at her feet, staring up at her with those bright green eyes. For the first time in days, Julia felt a shift in the air. It wasn't just a kitten, there was something more to him, something deeper. As if on cue, Milo leaped up, ran toward the hallway, and stopped at the door, meowing softly. His body stiffened, and his eyes narrowed, focusing on something, or someone, just beyond her sight. Julia froze, the letter still in her hands. What was going on? Why did Milo keep reacting like this? Was he sensing something she couldn't? She stood slowly, walking toward the door, heart racing with each step. The moment Julia reached for the doorknob, she felt a cold breeze rush past her, even though the windows were closed. Her heart pounded as she hesitated, looking down at Milo. The kitten was now growling softly, his body trembling. What was he sensing? And why had it all led her to this moment? Julia opened the door, and the hallway beyond was completely empty, but the air felt heavy, as if something or someone was watching her. Julia stepped into the hallway, her pulse quickening as the door creaked open. The apartment felt eerily quiet, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Milo remained by her side, his body tense, his wide green eyes darting back and forth, scanning the space with a wariness that sent shivers down her spine. His growl had subsided, but his instincts were clearly on high alert. Julia felt it too. Something was different. Something had changed in the air, and it wasn't just the silence. She took a hesitant step forward, glancing at the floor where she had found the strange paw prints the night before. The marks had vanished, as though they had never been there. The hallway was the same as it had always been, dimly lit, stretching from the living room to the bedrooms. But the sense of foreboding lingered, making it impossible for Julia to shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. Milo's ears flicked toward the far end of the hallway, where the shadows grew thicker. The kitten's eyes narrowed, and his body tensed as he crept closer to the darkness. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She tried to call his name, but no words came. The air felt thick, pressing in around her. She took a step closer, drawn inexplicably toward the far end of the hall. Suddenly, a soft whisper brushed against her ear, so faint she almost thought it was her imagination. She froze, her body stiffening. Was it just the wind, or was something or someone speaking to her? Her heart hammered in her chest as she spun around to face the empty apartment behind her. There was nothing. No one. She turned back to the hallway. Milo, who had been walking ahead, had stopped. His body was rigid, his back arched as he hissed, his eyes wide and unblinking. Julia's stomach twisted in knots. Something was wrong. She knew it. And it wasn't just her grief, her emotions clouding her mind. There was something real here, something deep in the very fabric of the apartment that was waking up. The air around her grew colder, the walls closing in, and the whispering grew louder, clearer now, though she couldn't quite make out the words. Panic began to rise in her throat, but Julia fought to keep herself calm. She had to understand what was happening. She had to face whatever this was. Milo suddenly bolted past her, darting toward the door to the bedroom, his claws clicking against the floor as he ran. Without thinking, Julia chased after him. The door to the bedroom creaked open with a sound that made Julia's heart race. As she stepped into the room, she saw him. Milo was sitting in front of the old wooden dresser, staring intently at something on the floor. Julia's breath caught as her eyes followed his gaze. Beneath the dresser was a small, dust-covered box. It looked ancient, worn, like it hadn't been touched in years. The box was slightly ajar, and from the cracks, she could see a faint glow, as if something was inside. The whispering, now clear and insistent, filled the room. Julia's hands shook as she bent down to open the box. Inside was a small, ornate key, tarnished with age. She could feel the weight of it in her palm, as if it were heavy with a history she had yet to understand. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, the whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But the moment had passed. Whatever was happening, whatever this was, had only just begun. As Julia stood up, holding the key in her hand, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The apartment was still, quiet, but the key was buzzing with an energy she couldn't comprehend, like it was pulsing with something ancient, something lost. And deep down, Julia knew this was just the beginning. What would the key unlock? And more importantly, what was it that the kitten was trying to protect her from? The key was heavier in Julia's hand than it had been when she first found it, almost as though it was pulling her toward something that she could not ignore. The air in the apartment felt different now, thick with an unspoken tension that Julia couldn't shake. The whispering had stopped, but the sense of urgency remained. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside seemed to carry with it a warning. Milo sat quietly beside her, his tail flicking back and forth, his bright green eyes never leaving the key. He had been oddly calm since the moment Julia had touched it, but there was something in his gaze, a knowing that unsettled her. It was as though he was waiting for her to make the next move. But what could she do? What was she supposed to do with a key that pulsed with unknown energy? And what was it that she was being drawn toward? Every logical part of her wanted to ignore it, to forget about the strange occurrences in her apartment. But deep down, Julia knew she couldn't. She couldn't turn away from this. Her hand tightened around the key, and before she could stop herself, she stood and walked toward the back door, the one she had never really noticed before, hidden behind a tapestry of old paintings and shelves. She had lived in the apartment for over a year, but never once had she felt the need to open it, until now. Milo followed her silently, his presence both comforting and unnerving. When Julia reached the door, her heart began to race. The key, which had once seemed like a simple object, now felt essential, like the answer to something she had been running from. Without hesitation, she inserted the key into the door's lock. The moment it turned, a low, grinding noise filled the room, as if the door had not been opened in years, perhaps even decades. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that descended into a forgotten part of the building. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and decay hit Julia's senses immediately. She could barely see the bottom of the stairs, and the only sound was the faint echo of her breath in the heavy silence. Milo stood at her feet, his fur bristling. He let out a low growl, a warning that sent chills down Julia's spine. She wanted to turn away, to lock the door and forget this ever happened. But the key, still warm in her hand, seemed to pulse with an undeniable force, urging her forward. Taking a deep breath, Julia stepped onto the first stair. The moment her foot touched it, the sound of something or someone scraping against the walls echoed from below. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more frantic with each step she took. The staircase was narrow, and the walls were so close that they seemed to close in on her with every movement. As Julia descended further, the scraping became more distinct. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something was down there, something waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Julia reached the bottom of the stairs, and the door at the end of the hallway opened before her, as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. The room beyond was pitch black, but the faintest glow shimmered from somewhere deep within, illuminating the corners of the space. Her breath caught in her throat as she took another step. Milo refused to follow. He stayed at the top of the stairs, meowing loudly as if calling out to her. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, there was a look in his eyes, a deep sadness, as if he knew what she was about to uncover, and that it was something she was not ready to face. Julia took one last breath, then stepped into the darkened room. As the door slammed shut behind her, the faint glow grew stronger, and Julia saw it, the walls covered with symbols, markings she couldn't understand. But it was what lay at the center of the room that stopped her heart. A large stone pedestal, and atop it, a crystal that pulsed with the same energy she had felt from the key. And as her eyes focused on it, she saw something else, written across the pedestal in bold, unmistakable letters. This is where it all ends.